Another interesting area that's come out recently are these learner corpora. But there was always that kind of comparative paradigm where you're comparing the learner to the native speaker. Since then, you're shifting it to a competence model because you're not saying what a learner's doing differently. You're saying, oh, what can they do? What can they do at A1? What can they do at A2?
Big beasts of English grammar. Why did you guys choose the name the Big Beasts?
I think we're in the book. We'll choose some big beasts. And let's just we'll go through one by one, see what's normally taught and what does the corpus evidence show us, but looking in particular at conversational English. So a corpus of conversational English. Students want to learn to communicate, they want to learn to talk. If we had to just wipe our brains of all our knowledge of English grammar.
Severance, we'll do some severance here.
Yes, exactly. And we just sat down together and we just got a load of English and we actually tried to build up an account of how English grammar works. And then we had to say, what are we going to teach? What would we choose?
If there was like a CELTA 2.0, maybe a CELTA 8.0 by now, how would you approach grammar in a new version of a CELTA?
This is interesting because they didn't use the word grammar. The word grammar was out for a long time in ELT because grammar meant this previous grammar like that you did in school. So they prefer the word structure. I found that in these 3 conditional forms. They were just 3 examples, and they were numbered because they were examples. So I don't think he called them like the first conditional, the second. So why is it 0? And I haven't quite found the origin of that, but it didn't seem, I've not found it before. I don't think the 80s.
It's like they forgot about it.
They did forget about it. It wasn't there. It was added. And 1, 2, and 3 were already taken. I can't say that for sure, but I've certainly not found any counter evidence to that.
If you could change one thing, just one thing about how English is taught around the world, what would it be?
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
Hey, it's Andrew from Learn Your English. As we start the show, I wanted to show you our new old home for our CPD courses, of which you as a podcast listener get 50% off. We started our company way back 7 years ago as a CPD focused organization, and we actually developed 3 standalone courses from that. And now, as I said, we have a new old home on Thinkific, and let's see what it looks like. We used to host on Thinkific, and now we're really excited to be back because we love it. We call this site the LYE School of Learning, and that's where we host all of our CPD offerings. You can see here the flagship ones at the top, Teaching Listening Made Easy on the left, SPA, Speaking, Pronunciation, and Autonomy in the middle, and Advanced Grammar for Teachers on the right. Let's take a look inside to see what it looks like. So I've opened up Teaching Listening Made Easy here. We actually designed this based on John Field's research about how to teach listening. What you'll learn is how to use authentic materials with any level of student, even beginners, and how to teach the skill of listening and not just test it. No comprehension questions. As you go through the course, you can also see what other teachers said. You can see teachers are doing that over here and adding to the discussion as well. And as I mentioned, the 50% discount has already been applied at checkout for all of you who listen to and support our show. If you have any questions about the courses, just let us know, and I hope you enjoy them. Does the grammar that's normally taught match the evidence that Corpus Linguistics shows? That's the question we asked Dr. Graham Burton to dissect, and we're very happy when he accepted our invitation to talk on today's episode. Graham specializes in Corpus Linguistics, and he's an assistant professor at the Free University of Bozen-Bolzano in Italy. His main research interests are corpus linguistics, of course, the application of them for teachers, for learners, for students, to teaching materials, to curriculum, to materials development, to pedagogical grammar, academic writing, and multilingualism. So again, you can see why we're excited to chat with him today. We also get into some misconceptions of teaching grammar, and Graham has some myths that he wants to help debunk today. Graham also has 2 new books available, and he was kind enough to share some discount codes with us for all of you, and they're below in the description. We hope you enjoy the episode. Graham was very gracious with his time. You're going to learn a lot. We learned a lot from this. Let's get into it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Teacher Talking Time podcast. And in today's episode, we're going to be dealing with I would say perhaps one of the most favorite topics for language teachers out there. And if you said the word grammar, you are definitely right. Today, we're going to have a very, I would say, an insightful conversation with someone that I came across his work actually a couple of years ago when he released a book about the history of grammar in English language teaching. He's written some very interesting and insightful articles and papers as well. And when his book came out, I think when he announced that the book was coming out, I said, you know what, I need to get this guy on the podcast. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're very happy to have here with us Graham Burton. Graham, and welcome to the show.
Thanks. Hi, everyone.
I was thinking, Graham, a lot of people probably don't know who you are, so maybe we should start there. Who is Graham and why does your work matter?
Wow. Well, I wouldn't be so presumptuous to say that my work does matter. So my origin story, I think I've got a quite typical background in a way for a kind of native speaker teacher, for want of a better term. So I got into teaching straight after university. Actually, there was a kind of slightly interesting story. I remember I was standing outside a seminar room. I was studying linguistics. That was my first degree. And there was this notice board. And I remember just noticing it had this label on TEFL notice board. And I just remember thinking, what is this TEFL? And I think I'd seen it somewhere, at least more than once, but I didn't know what it meant. And so at some point I found out what it meant. And I do remember thinking, that was interesting. It could do that. So it wasn't really my intention to get into teaching, and then funnily enough, I think that same year, university year in the summer, I was speaking to a friend from home, and she was telling me that she was doing this course, training to be an English teacher, and then she was going to go and live abroad. I can remember thinking, what is this? I never heard of this. What is this course? It's such a good idea. And then I think a year later, I did the same thing. So she went off to South America, and I was still at university when I did it. So I taught that summer and then went back and finished my degree. So then, for a few years, I was a language teacher. I taught in the UK for a little bit, and then I went to Greece. When I was in Greece, I got a little bit started working in ELT publishing. And I did a little bit of writing and stuff. And then when I went back to the UK, I didn't really want to, but I ended up working in publishing for a couple of years as an editor for Pearson, or Longman, were also known as Pearson Longman. I think they were actually called at the time. Then I got fed up being in an office, wanted to go back into teaching. That's when I moved to Italy, where I still am 17 years later. And gradually I did a master's first and then a PhD. So I gradually moved into academia. But everything I do really in academia, I think, goes back a lot or relates a lot to my teaching career. Also what I did in publishing, because I carried on working as a freelancer as well after I left and went to Italy. But then I think a lot of things I did then also related right back to the beginning of my career, because if I think about having studied linguistics, I was always really interested in this kind of language analysis aspect of things. Pedagogy was interesting, methodology and things like that. But I can still remember when I did this. So I did the CELTA, the Cambridge CELTA, and I can still remember the first time we observed a lesson. And so we were just there in the class. And I was really curious to see what a course book would look like for English. Because I was thinking, I did French at school and German at school. And I was almost excited looking at it. I remember I was looking over the student's shoulders. I want to see this book. What does it look like? What's in there? So I was really interested in that content side of things. But I think it was just because I think I've got an analytical brain. I like to analyze things, but also that's what I was doing. I was doing a very different kind of analysis because it was all of Chomsky and things like that. But I really enjoyed that aspect of teaching, always have done. And I always thought, in terms of methodology, I think there's more than one way to get there. But if you're not teaching the right things, kind of methodology doesn't matter. And so I was always thinking about that a little bit. Does it make sense? Is this law that we're teaching? Does it make sense? Or does it make sense to teach this grammar at all? So I was always interested in it.
You've mentioned that you taught in different countries like Italy, Greece, the UK. I'm curious about one thing. What would be some of the perhaps most important differences that you've noticed in how English is taught and learned perhaps in these different contexts? Because we're in Canada. I've taught in a bunch of different countries as well. Andrew has taught in, I think, Costa Rica as well, Andrew.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if I've never taught in Italy, Greece, or the UK. So I'm wondering if there were differences that you've noticed in the way people approach how English is taught and learned in those contexts.
Yeah, and I think that was it's always been very formative for me. But certainly was some of the changes, absolutely. So I guess when I taught in the UK, a lot of the stuff I'd done in the CELTA course worked off the shelf because there was a lot of pair work and all of those things just worked straight away because I was in my early 20s, so most of my students, they were there, I think you could get a kind of a study visa. There were a lot from South America, a lot from Brazil, I remember. You could get a study visa if you were doing maybe 15 hours or 20 hours a week of studies, and then you could work as well. But they were super motivated always because they were living there. And so you could just teach them anything. I would always then say this kind of slang way of saying this, or teaching them pronunciation, loads of things like that. And they would just generally lap it up. They were really motivated and interested, even if they weren't massively, I don't think they did a whole lot outside of the classroom, and they weren't trying to do any exam or anything like that, but they were literally living in London and wanted to be able to speak English better. And it was all, I don't want to say it was easy, but you certainly didn't have motivational problems. And I think you said to them about English they would be interested in. Really. Went to Greece. So Greece was mainly teaching. So Greece has this whole kind of system of very small local private language schools, but not just language schools, just top-up schools. So the teenagers would maybe they'd go to the maths school, top-up school, after school. So for various subjects, but English was the big one, I think, where almost everyone did these lessons on top of what they did at school. So they're generally teenagers, although sometimes even younger ones. And what are they doing? They're focusing on an exam because there was this thing that they wanted to pass the B2 by the age of 16 because they wanted then to be able to do C2 before they went to university.
Wow.
Because once they get to university, they're busy with other things, with studying for university, and then they want to get a job. And basically the C2 exam was to help them get a job or to help them to earn more money, because you would typically, that's the way it seemed to work contractually. You get more money for the higher you got. And I do remember this quite near the beginning, teaching there, and I did make some reference to, I don't remember what it was. It was not proverb, but some kind of slang or something like that. And saying, oh yeah, but in London we say this. And thinking there would be this kind of reaction like I'd been getting for the previous year. And everyone, they're just staring at me blankly. We don't care. We didn't care less. And that was really interesting and formative. The other thing that happened in that school as well, like these are very small local schools, and there would typically be a head teacher who was also the owner and your boss. And so they just had a way to work that they wanted you to work in. And I can remember we were given this kind of like a manual almost of how to teach. It didn't say that, but that was just the kind of the way you should do it in this school. And it said, I just remember one thing, it said, avoid all pair work activities and any other activities that might disrupt the lesson.
Wow.
So you're like, wow, okay. So again, this is a big difference, right? So
Yeah.
what were we doing? So you're there. So this is after school. So you're there with these teenagers, maybe at 9 o'clock at night, because I think I used to teach from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m.
Wow.
And you're there in this class where you can't do any pair work activities, can't do any group work, where any interaction is teacher to learner.
Whoa.
But you know what? They were then going and passing C2 exams or B2 exams. And if you spoke to them, they could speak. So that was also massively formative for me as well, because this wasn't what I'd been told. I'd been told, hey, no, they've got to be able to do pair work and all this kind of stuff that we'd done on the CELTA. And suddenly I was seeing that actually there's more than one way to get there. They probably wasn't a very enjoyable experience all the time in class for them, but it did still seem to work. They were doing kind of intense practice.
Yeah.
They were doing homework. They were very motivated because of the exam. They were studying and working hard. And it did work as a method.
Really, eh?
As much as it wasn't particularly pleasurable, but it had its effect. It was undeniable. I had the evidence in front of me that they got to the level they were with me, and then I would see the progress during the lessons. So that was also very interesting for me.
Fascinating.
You know, what's fascinating is that we have been talking to so many researchers, applied linguists, and everyone's saying that explicit grammar teaching doesn't really lead to the kind of fluency that people are expected to achieve after learning a language. But I feel like these Greek students who were perhaps, I would say, extrinsically motivated to learn the language because all they wanted was a certificate, pass, get a B2, get to C2, get a job. As you said, they were still able to communicate after learning grammar that way, without pair work, without the what we say in SLA that is required, like the negotiation of meaning, pushed output, and things like that. I don't know.
It's
Impressed.
curious too, because Graham, you said in the handbook or the manual or whatever they gave you, don't do pair work or anything that would disrupt the lesson. And that word, it's a pretty powerful word. So it seems like they had a straight arrow approach to this is, if you do this, they will get to this, or they will pass the B2 exam. But disrupt the lesson, like normally, as Leo was saying, we would think of not doing that as potentially disrupting the lesson. It seems a little bit the other way around.
Yeah, I don't want to overstate. Okay, so two things. So it wasn't that every lesson was just explicit study of grammar, because we were using a course book, and so they were doing reading activities, they were doing vocabulary. And then I do seem to remember, I think before the one to literally have the exam that year, they had a couple of months of extra lessons leading up to the exam where you would do speaking practice, but it was just simulating the exam, the oral exam. So in terms of their fluency, yeah, they weren't great. They were good enough to pass the exam. They were good enough to pass a 12-minute pair oral test with very predictable, reasonably predictable content, because they're going to compare two photos and they're going to choose a present for the grandma's birth, the kind of things you have to do in Cambridge exams. So I wouldn't overstate it, but it was doing something. It had some effect. This very controlled style of teaching. And they were able to, I seem to have the impression they were able to move from that explicit study to a certain amount of implicit knowledge. That I think it was very noticeable that they weren't very good at the discourse level. And I remember trying to teach them that, of responding, because the exam was done in pairs of candidates, and there was tasks where they were both supposed to be talking and interacting, and they would wait their turn in silence, and they wouldn't even look at each other. So you try and work on that a little bit and say yes, and teach these phrases. Yes, I agree, and things like that. Somewhat. Also, looking back, you see some of those phrases robotic and not very authentic. I partially agree with you, things like that. But
yes,
there was that kind of extra input. But
yeah,
so that was certainly a kind of formative moment. But to see, yeah, that there's more than one way of getting there, maybe. Then, of course, I've taught in other contexts. I've taught in Italy. There was a language school again, but teaching with adults. But I've taught at universities. I've taught EAP. Taught ESP courses, and so there's always something different. I've been involved in university teaching at university mainly for quite a long time now, and there it's not dissimilar to Greece in a way, because the first thing they want to know is what's in the exam, what's the assessment. So you better make sure your assessment is going to be something useful that will force your lessons to be somehow useful and fun.
Would you describe the teaching at the university primarily ESP or EAP oriented, or is there opportunities for task oriented, or perhaps even something more task-based, or is it just purely?
It depends which course you're talking about, because then I've taught a whole load of different courses at the university I work at now. A lot of what I do now actually is teach training, and if not, it's EAP. Before that, I did teach some ESP courses. It comes down a lot. It does come, in terms of what you do, it does come down to assessment to an extent. If you can think of a way of integrating tasks into an assessment, then it would make sense to do lots of tasks during the course. If that doesn't seem so feasible, then you probably wouldn't do that. I've tried to do that because during my master's, I remember I wrote an assignment on task-based language teaching, and I found it very interesting. And I have integrated certain elements of task-based teaching when I've taught courses. It really depends on, but a lot of these things depend on what the students' own experiences are, what they bring with them into the classroom about what's going to work and what's not going to work, at least in my experience.
You've mentioned earlier in our conversation that you feel like you had somewhat of an analytical brain, and one of your main research interests is corpus linguistics and how it applies in English language teaching. I think a question that a lot of teachers often ask me whenever I talk about corpora or corpus tools is this: in your opinion, Graham, like How do you envision or how do you see Corpus tools helping teachers design better learning materials?
Yeah. Do I envisage that? In a way, it's putting a lot on the teacher, isn't it? To expect them to do that, because you're asking them to potentially have to reinvent materials that they don't have time to reinvent. So I guess this is a distinction that's been made in the literature between direct and indirect applications of corpus linguistics. So the direct applications would be things like data-driven learning, or even just, teachers working directly with the corpora themselves or getting the learners to do that in class, whereas the indirect applications would be that you're using it to inform materials and things like that. Like I said, I think my own background in publishing and having worked as an editor, having worked as an author as well, having written teaching materials, I think I've always considered it from that point of view of thinking how can it inform materials that then would be used by many teachers. There's different ways you can use it, I think, or you can use corpora. What I found interesting initially definitely was the idea of going back and looking at generally is grammar. What's said about grammar? What claims are made?
Right.
When you've got a grammar rule, you're making a claim, right? So what claims are made, and is there an empirical basis for that? And in English language teaching, I think sometimes the rules are pretty much right, but then sometimes you look at them, and I can remember right back to doing the CELTA, some of the stuff we looked at in the CELTA. Say, this doesn't sound right. I don't think that's true. They're telling us to teach this. I don't think that's right. That was the problem of having the linguistics undergraduate in that group properly, because I think I was a bit cocky as well. So I think I was saying, I don't think this is right. I don't know. Anyway, I was probably quite annoying then with my analytical way of thinking, and also doing all this kind of tree diagrams and Chomsky, and then coming across a pedagogical grammar rule, which has really got a whole different purpose. But one of the things to say, I think Michael Swan wrote a good article. I think he called it design criteria for pedagogical rules. It was something like that. And there are different criteria where, okay, you'd want a rule that's simple, for example. It's not just for grammar, but grammar is kind of the most obvious one, really. But you'd also want a rule that's true. And those two don't always go together, right?
It's always true, yeah.
It's not always going to be true. So you simplify something to make it digestible in class.
Right.
But you might lose some truth value in doing so. Those are just two of the criteria that he mentioned. So you have to be a little bit careful, but I think it is interesting to do that, to look at what's the empirical evidence about how language is used, and let's go and see what we're teaching learners. Because in the end, the kind of grammar that's used in language teaching, it's a kind of like a compromise between descriptive and prescriptive. Because basically you should be describing use, but it is prescriptive because you're telling the language learners, so you're telling them what to say. So it's a kind of, it's a mix of the two things. But the first phase of that, the descriptive phase, should be, saying how is it that people, I mean, we have to decide which people we're interested in, but how is it that people are using English, and what can we, and so one way of discovering that is by using corpora. So that's only one way of doing it. Of course, another interesting area that's come out recently are learner corpora. So what is it that learners are doing? And initially that was done very much in terms of through a comparison with native speaker corpora. So you would see what the learners not do much of compared to native speakers, or what do they maybe do a lot of, more than native speakers? Are there things they're overusing, are things they're underusing, and are there things they're just getting wrong? Are they just common errors? But there was always that kind of comparative paradigm where you're comparing the learner to the native speaker.
Right.
Since then, we've got these corpora that are calibrated to level, like the Cambridge Learner Corpus, and it's because of things like that we can have things like the English profile. So here you're shifting it not so much to a kind of almost like a deficit model, you're shifting it to a competence model, because you're not saying what a learner's doing differently. You're saying, oh, what can they do? What can they do at A1? What can they do at A2?
Right.
And I always think from a learner's point of view, that's I think, a really powerful idea, because you think, if I was B1, what would I really want to know next? I'd think, what is it the B2 learners, speakers can do?
Right. Can do better than I do.
I want to know what
yeah.
they can do. And what is it they can do better? Or what do they know that I don't know? Or how is it they can use? One of the interesting things with this type of data is that you can see what has been described by Anna O'Keefe and Geraldine Mark as grammatical polysemy. So you see the learners are using a certain area of grammar, but in more ways, in different ways, in new ways, as they progress up through competency levels. And I think that's a very interesting idea as well.
Can you expand on that grammatical polysemy? Because I think that's an interesting area. I know the word polysemy, but grammatical polysemy is not something I'm familiar with. What would be an example of that, Graham, just so people are able to visualize that?
Yeah, I think you can see it quite easily, actually, in a lot of course book series, because there are grammar points that are repeated across levels.
Right.
But when you look at the detail of it, you'll see that they're often teaching something slightly different. So you might teach going to initially to talk about intentions. Then at the next level, you might see going to talk about predictions. But that's quite a kind of, I won't say an extreme example. That's a very clear-cut example of two different kind of ELT functions. But you do see more subtle ones when you look at the data. And you can also see a kind of an expansion also in terms of vocabulary. So you might see, for example, that learners begin to use can at a certain level, but they'll use it just with a few verbs.
Right.
Or would is one, like would is an example of this, where you'll see would, they can use it kind of A1, but actually it's just in would like. And then they're gradually going to start using it with more and more verbs and in different functional contexts.
I remember
that's the idea
that.
Of the grammatical.
I remember this. Thank you. I was actually thinking now, because you've mentioned that. I remember reading, I don't remember which paper this was, but I remember that the research that I did back in the day was that used to is often used to teach about past habits and things like that. But I remember doing the research and finding out that used to is almost like the first thing you normally say when you're talking about a past habit. So if you're maintaining a conversation, you just say, no, I used to smoke. I would smoke right after class. I would smoke 5 cigarettes a day. So you normally use would more to talk about habits than you would use used to. But in grammar, we have to isolate these. And just to paraphrase not to paraphrase, but to coin what Scott said yesterday, it's just like you have to really teach these McNuggets, these grammar McNuggets, and expect that they would master used to. But then normally what I would see, Graham, is students would be able to talk about their habits, but they would only give me a line. They would just say, oh yeah, I used to smoke. I said, yeah, and then I used to smoke. And then they would and I think it goes back to what you're saying with overuse of the same tense. So they would just basically speak using used to the whole time to talk about past habits. Polysemy. Interesting.
Is corpogram, like what you're describing now, is this, sorry to ask a binary question, but is this more useful for teachers in terms of understanding the role of grammar, how it works, and less useful than designing materials for it, or can it be both?
I think it could definitely be both. Again, it depends how the corpus. If I think as a teacher, of course, we're talking about grammar here, but you can, from a corpus, very easily generate, for example, if you make your own small corpus, you could generate lists of frequent words. You could generate lists of n-grams, so a 2-word, 3-word, common 4-word, or you make lists of collocations. And that could be something that can directly go into a worksheet. I'm just thinking about this because I'm just preparing a little teacher training session I'm going to be doing soon about ESP, and just looking back at some stuff that I had prepared for one particular ESP course where I'd done that. I generated also keywords, which are keyword analysis is a statistical analysis which shows words that are unusually frequent in a corpus that you've selected compared to another corpus. And that often will tell you something about the nature of the corpus, but it will identify topical words typically related to that particular corpus. So I think you can use it. You can use corpus certainly to sort of creating classroom materials. In terms of grammar, it's what are you trying to do? So you're teaching a certain grammar point. As a teacher, would you need to go into a corpus to do something about that grammar point? I guess you might if you were skeptical about what the grammatical explanation was. If you were happy with the grammatical explanation, it convinces you, and you think everything works fine with that, then perhaps you wouldn't bother. you might go in to look at, you might want to see some examples, but getting examples from corpora is not always easy because you don't find those very nice standalone
Yeah. You get
examples that
pieces.
don't
you
need
get-
any
yeah.
wider context to be understood. You can find them, but you have to look a little bit for
Yeah.
them.
Notice. The reason I ask is, Leo, remember, like, this was years ago, early days of our podcast. We interviewed Susan Hunston,
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
who
I
talks
remember that.
about pattern grammar. And oftentimes as teachers, we think about grammar as is isolated. Like, how do I use would for I would like in level 1, and then in level 2, it's for something else. And I found the quote that the big one from her episode, and she said, when a word changes its meaning, it then adopts the pattern of the new meaning. The pattern classifies the meaning of the word. And she goes on to say and emphasizes that it's the teacher's responsibility, in her opinion, to activate and seek those patterns in text and curricula, even if they're not explicitly stated, which is a very powerful
Yeah.
statement. But in reality, we all know that that is not something to be like, you can't. It's more of an exercise in noticing and a habit of that. It would be my take on it, because a teacher or a learner is not going to memorize every pattern of a word that has. But how does corpora, how does it adopt, or how can we look at it from an analysis of patterns instead of just maybe to use the example of used to? How does pattern grammar play into corpora?
You really, as a teacher, you don't have to do anything because Susan Hunston did it all, right? That's been done.
Yes.
She worked on that for a very long time. And there were
Touché.
publications. There was Collins published a whole load of stuff. And they're all available online now. They're open access. I was very interested in patterns for a while. And yeah, I would, because it's one of those things that is taught, right? You get the classic verb patterns lesson. And the learners learn, okay, it's verb plus ing or verb plus infinitive or verb plus 2 plus infinitive. And that's the end of the story. I can remember when I first started, this would have been, I remember very specifically, this would have been pretty much first year of teaching. So I was in London in this language school and used to try and do writing from time to time. I didn't really know what it meant to teach writing then, but sometimes the learners would ask for it. Well, they'd often ask for it. Then they didn't like it when they had to do it, but they want more writing, they would say. More grammar, more writing. That was often what they were actually asking for. And I can remember sometimes struggling to correct them. Not in the sense that I didn't know, I knew what was wrong, but I didn't know why it was wrong. And I think it was when I got and I studied pattern grammar, I thought, yeah, that was probably what was going on then. It was just the pattern was wrong. And it didn't break any particular pedagogical grammar rule that I had learned as a teacher. It was just, you just don't find that particular verb in that particular pattern. So, I get what she was saying then, but it's putting a lot on the teacher again, isn't it? Because it's saying the teacher has to do all of these things that the teacher's already quite busy, I think. So getting them to somehow spontaneous, I don't know what she said exactly, but getting them to integrate all of this pattern grammar approach into the teaching is not easy. There are those tutorials, they're good. And like I said, they're available online now. There was some, I think that the actual patterns you can get online.
Yes.
There were also a couple of exercise books, and I actually bought them at some point, which are way out of print now. All of that research came from corpora.
Yeah.
Came from corpus analysis. Yeah, but I don't know. I think if you still go on the Collins dictionary and look up a word, I think it comes up with a pattern. It always used to.
Yeah.
But I agree with what you're saying there. I think it's true that probably the best we can do is be aware of that as a teacher and therefore be able to communicate that to a learner, but really in the hope that they're going to acquire this kind of thing more implicitly, because there's not going to, even in Greece, these teenagers in Greece, as disciplined as they were,
I was
prepared for
gonna
the exam,
say.
even they wouldn't have learned page after page of verb patterns. It's not going to, I don't see most learners doing that. But if you can point out the patterns nature of language, so that they can understand that it's like that and that it's worth noticing those patterns, then I think it would be helpful to them. And yeah, going beyond that, just simply verb, ing, verb, infinitive, which is the only pattern.
That's the only pattern I was going to say we see in textbooks. And I remember when because I did my MA with Susan Hunston at Birmingham, and I remember getting copies of Collins Co-Build. I got a copy of the lexical syllabus. I got a copy of Dave Willis's and Jane Willis's textbook. And it's a really difficult textbook to work with. If you're not familiar with corpora, if you're not familiar with patterns or task-based language teaching, No wonder that book tanked, because you have to be highly proficient in these things in order to be able to use them. And since we're talking about this, I want to jump into the book now, Grammar, because you co-wrote a book with Chris Jones, The Big Beasts of English Grammar. I wanted to ask, first of all, about the title. Why did you guys choose the name The Big Beasts?
Yeah. So we didn't come up with that term. That was Ivor Timmis, who's another researcher.
Oh, yes.
He used that term, I think, in a book that Chris edited. And I think I'd seen it quoted elsewhere. And I like it because you know what it means, right? The big beast of grammar. It's a nice image, but you also know instantly what it means. And so at some point, actually what happened was last year we went to a conference and we did a kind of presentation about one of the chapters in the book. And I wrote the abstract for this paper that we submitted, and I chose that particular phrase, the big beasts of grammar, as the name of the conference paper. And then at the conference, we noticed we heard quite a few people talking about it. And so Chris said, I think we found the name for the book, because we didn't have the name for the book. So that was why we went for the title. But yeah, to be honest, Ivor was using it more negatively than we were, because the way Ivor used it, I don't remember the chapter, what it was called, but it's about a text-based approach to teaching. And he's basically saying that if you use texts as your main kind of inputs, then you will spend a lot more time focusing on lexicogrammar, which are things like patterns, absolutely, and less time on the big beasts of grammar. So he's saying they're too big almost. They're dominating, they're taking up too much space. I think in the book, we're not really saying that. The idea was, this was Chris's idea. We'll choose some we weren't calling it that, choose some big beasts.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just go through one by one, see what's normally taught and what does the corpus evidence show us. But looking in particular at conversational English. So
Right.
a corpus of conversational English. So that was the idea, especially because that's supposed to be what we always say, right? Students want to learn to communicate. They want to learn to talk. So you'd think that would be our main model, right? Conversational language, because that's what we're always trying to do in class, trying to get them to have conversations and talk to each other. But actually, if you look at the way a lot of grammar points are explained, they seem to be maybe reflecting written language.
Oh, yeah.
So that was the idea, to make
Absolutely.
that comparison, to see what apply. And what happens if you just start with that was one of the things we tried to do. For each chapter, we have this deep dive where we basically generated what are called concordance lines. So this is just when you go to a corpus and you search for a particular word or a phrase, and it just gives you line after line after line of examples of this. So, for example, we have a chapter on will and going to. So we generated 200 lines with will and 200 lines with going to. And we just went into them as being as minded as we could, because, of course, we all bring our baggage and everything from what we've seen before. And just decide what's going on here. How is it being used? How is each one in each example? Is it talking about the future? How's it being used? What do we notice? And so we did that for each chapter, tried to take this kind of a slightly fresh approach, but just looking at things just with an open mind and seeing what we notice rather than trying to find examples of what's already been described. And so that was, the basic idea of the book there.
The question of if teachers need to earn more money to stay in ELT is really the wrong question these days. That one's largely been answered with precarity, 0-hour contracts, inconsistent work. The question isn't, do I need to earn more? The question really is, how do I make it work? Our TAP program, or Teacher Accelerator program, works with teachers like you directly to help make it happen. Through the process of being in the program, we help teachers build a lean, profitable, and pedagogically sound teaching business. 3 pillars that are really important to us. We started Learn Your English based on pedagogy, responsive pedagogy, evidence-supported teaching through research. One of the reasons we started this podcast as well. And we apply that now working with teachers to build courses, offers, and support for their clients in the same manner. The TAP program really is your roadmap to monetize your skills by, number 1, creating an irresistible offer, number 2, selling it effectively, and number 3, securing consistent clients, 3 pillars of any successful business. And while no one in ELT is building multi-million-dollar businesses in this fashion, it's a way for you and for all of us to first stay in the industry, to work with people that we love to help, to get paid for our work. And our goal for anyone who joins us in the program is within a 6 to 12 month period, you can make an informed choice, meaning you've built your business up to a certain point where you can use information to decide if keeping your school job and your business or just doing the business on its own is the right choice for you. If you want more information on if the program is a good fit for you or how we would work together, there's a link below. You can book a free chat with us. We can go through all of the details. There's lots of resources on our landing page, our website, and on this YouTube channel as well. And lots of interviews with clients that we've worked with where you can hear their stories, what it was like, and see if that resonates with you. If you're looking to earn a little bit more and really establish yourself in your niche, in your field this year, we'd love to chat. And now, let's get back to the show.
Hey, I'm Mike Sad from Kelowna, BC, and you're listening to Teacher Talking Time, the Learn Your English podcast.
Since we're on the will and going to, I feel like this would be the best moment for us to actually talk about this. And I think we were just chatting about this before we started recording. It was this conversation. We had a chat with Scott on a podcast, and he was telling us that story, that will is normally taught as expressing some sort of spontaneous in the moment type of decision, while going to is used for premeditated or intentions. And then the student basically mentioned that, oh, but I never make any spontaneous decisions. So that student will probably never going to use will. But your research in the book, you found that the distinction is not so clear when it comes to real conversation. I think the question then becomes, if this is what teachers are normally being fed through textbooks, and this is what they're actually feeding their students, I think the question then becomes, Graham, how should teachers then rethink the way they present these structures to students?
Yeah, that depends. Okay, so we're talking about will and going to here. I think one of the things I would say that generally will and going to, on the whole, they behaved in our data when we looked at it, they behaved pretty much like they're described in general grammars and in pedagogical grammar for English as a foreign language. But the thing is, it becomes a question of tendency, right?
Right.
So yeah, if you're talking about intentions, you will tend to use going to. But we did find examples with will, for instance. And then with will, yeah, it does tend to be used for what seem to be more like spontaneous decisions. It's more modal, so you get these kind of promises.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we noticed was that promises could be about another person. That was interesting. Oh, he'll help, he'll do that, something like that.
Right.
He'll know. So you're promising something about some other person, which is maybe not typically taught. But what we noticed overall was both of them were overwhelmingly used for making predictions, which was interesting. And then we noticed as well, because the difference is normally taught is that going to is supposed to be predictions when you've got present evidence.
Yeah.
So you've got the classic, look at those clouds, it's going to rain. And in the other book, which I don't know if we'll have time to talk about, which
we
was
will.
partly a look at the history of grammar in English language teaching, I think that example in like the 1920s or the 1930s, that example has been doing the rounds for
The clouds.
decades.
Really?
Okay.
Yeah, and look at the clouds, it's going to rain. I mean, it's super clear, right? But what we started to notice was that there were also these, seemed like predictions with going to, and we thought, but there's no present evidence here. And then what we noticed was actually sometimes when we use it, we use going to when there's not present evidence, but the other person knows the reason for the prediction. So the one particular example we've got is I think they're talking about buying a phone for an older relative. And someone says, oh yeah, but she's not going to be able to use that because the buttons are too small. But they don't have the phone in front of them. They don't have the old person, this old relative in front of them. But that's an appeal to shared knowledge.
Right.
And so that's what we notice generally is that it's very interpersonal, the use of the grammar. So whereas in ELT we have this kind of tendency to maybe focus on, to link, I think often now there's a link between try and link, okay, you've got this situation X and that dictates a grammar structure A.
Yeah.
But it's often not that, because it's often about what the speaker's trying to communicate. It's often about the relationship between the speakers. So in this case, it's not this thing of some external physical evidence that they're looking at that they can see. It's their relationship with one another. They have a shared understanding, and so therefore they make a prediction based on that shared understanding, and then they're using going to. So it's the same thing, but it's just not in
Very
that
interesting.
concrete way. Throughout the book, we try and have, at the end of each chapter, we do have some implications. The implications are not always easy, because, for example, we found that overwhelmingly both will and going to are used for prediction. How do you translate that into a curriculum? It's hard, isn't it? Because does that mean that you should spend, let's say we find a ratio of 2 to 1 of, let's say, prediction and intention. Does that mean we should spend twice as much classroom time on prediction than intention?
Yeah.
I think some people would say, yes. I've definitely heard these kind of arguments saying that frequency like this should dictate what we're teaching, and so the most frequent things we should be spending more time on. But I don't think it's that simple, because I think sometimes it could be, maybe you would say it's very infrequent, so we should really spend some time on this in class because the students aren't going to hear it very much, and they're not going to come across it.
It's a good argument.
But so something like the kind of infamous third conditional, which some people have said, that's a waste of time because it's so infrequent. But when you need to use it, you've got to get it right. Or when you hear it, you've got to understand that it's about the hypothetical past situation, right?
Yes.
Or if you want to express a past, there's no other really way of doing it. And so as infrequent it is, you think, but they're not going to get it by themselves. We know learners are now really exposed to English a lot, but those least frequent things, they're obviously going to get less exposure to also outside of the class. So maybe there's an argument for saying, let's focus on the infrequent things, as counterintuitive as that sounds. So we did our best for each chapter to have implications. And so sometimes the implications are maybe make more room for this, or maybe de-emphasize certain things. But it's not always easy. I think it's up to the individual teacher very often, or the individual curriculum designer, and about the needs of the learners, of course.
I was going to say, every classroom could be different, and where they will, or where they might hear something or won't hear something. Your Greek students probably would hear different things, or certainly would hear different things than the ones that were in London, right? When they walk outside the shops, the cafes, things like that. It reminds me, like that will going to distinction. That's really interesting about the predictions, that they're both used for predictions. Leo remembers this too. When we talked to Bill Van Patten last year, and he was talking mostly about how a person's brain is predisposed to learn or not learn something. And he claims, and his research shows, that grammar rules are not like psychologically real in someone's brain, where they don't comprehend them.
Yeah, there's no reality for them,
And just to be honest, I'm not even fully sure I've comprehended what the difference is between this and that. I guess the simple answer is examples, right, in the class, and just through context and through tasks. Because while a simple will going to can have different meanings and implications, the rules themselves, do you agree, that won't be comprehended or even if the rule in the sentence will be on board, that doesn't necessarily transfer to, using them in a way that would follow the rule, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think we've all probably seen that as teachers, right? Where you teach something and you do a really good job of the explanation, but then when it comes to spontaneous output, it doesn't seem to have made its way there. But then we've all seen the opposite, right? We've all done lessons where it has, and that's always a puzzle for me. Sometimes it does work. This much maligned PPP, we've all had these PPP lessons where you want to tear your hair out at the end because you spent half an hour doing all this controlled practice, and then they're just not using the language how you want to. But equally, we've had these lessons, great, everything just worked perfectly, and you're happy, they're happy, everyone's had a great day. So it is a kind of a mystery. And the debate between, can explicit knowledge become implicit knowledge? I don't think anyone really believes that it can just switch from one to the other. So the question is, some people have claimed that it's somehow, the explicit knowledge can allow make the implicit knowledge easier to achieve somehow. But I think the thing with the psychological reality, again, I mean, I share your amusement a little bit, because I do remember reading about this, because that's quite a big part of the literature on pedagogical grammar, which I read a lot of during my PhD and writing the other book. There is, the idea of how we would describe grammar if you were to write down how grammar is functioning and so basically rules, is that really a representation of what's going on in the brain? Is the mental representation? And probably not. So then the question is, but can you somehow use one to help the other? And I think what you're saying about examples, that's an interesting point. And something I've noticed, if you look at, I don't know if you use Murphy's grammar books so much in Canada. I know you've got it in
here. The most
Azar.
popular Azar. Azar is the
Yeah.
most popular here. Yeah.
So Murphy is the kind of the British English equivalent, and those books have been going since I think the 80s, if not maybe the 90s.
My mother studied English with those books, so yeah, she had a copy.
Look at the latest editions.
Mm.
There's hardly any grammar explanation.
Really?
Like
Okay.
in the sense of really saying of really explicit rules. So what very much they're using examples. So you'll have, it's still very much, so you've got this page which is present perfect continuous or whatever. But then there'll be this box with examples, and after each example, there might be a kind of thing in brackets, equals, and explaining the meaning. But the example comes first. I don't know where that's come from. I guess most of these things in published materials come from feedback from the markets and everything. So it seems to be something people like. But I did a presentation about this. It's something that'd be interesting to go into because I've also got grammars from the first half of the 20th century, which are certainly more complex in terms of how they try and describe what's going on. And we've gradually moved, at least with Murphy, you can see that the latest iteration is very example heavy, which is a really good thing because I guess that's the other thing as teachers we've experienced where you give your explanation and you think it's really clear. And then there's the learner say, can you give us an example? And of course they want that, right? They want the example, but you start with the example maybe. Which, to be fair, a lot of course books do.
Yes.
You've got an input text and you've got the grammar in there within the text, and then you pull a couple out. But I think that does seem to be something that learners seem to like, and maybe the publishers have picked up on there. They move away from just this classic kind of list of rules and then the example. They just need to be given examples and then explanations in brackets, which is.
But here's the thing too, Graham, because I think in the book, in the research that I've read, you hint or suggest that I think one of the issues is that learners don't often see enough examples of how grammar works in natural speech. So they're basically getting these completely decontextualized sentences that are chunked and look almost perfect. I think the question then becomes, because this is something that I'm always wondering whenever I'm working with teachers, is are there any changes, or perhaps what small changes can teachers make perhaps in their classrooms to better reflect, to better provide students with this real life usage of language? Or do you have any advice for teachers on that?
Totally get your point. The thing with the very concrete examples is interesting. And in fact, this is something I've been thinking about, and I'm hoping to present a paper on it later this year, where a lot of the grammar explanations, and this isn't just in English language teaching, this is also in general descriptive grammars. They focus on these very prototypical explanations of grammar. And in fact, in the book, one of the things we looked at with comparatives is every comparative sentence, London is bigger than Paris, and super, super clear. And then you look at the conversational data and you don't get these really very concrete comparisons because it's much more understood. The context is shared and it's understood. And the same with superlatives, I remember. The most common nouns after a superlative were things like one and thing, and to say the best thing, the slowest one. So because they're decontextualized, they have to be made to be understandable. They have to be made very concrete. And so you get these super concrete kind of prototypical examples. So that's a question. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So it's a very clear way of explaining the grammar, but it doesn't really reflect how we're using the grammar.
Yeah.
But again, we're short of time and we're short of space in books and short of space in worksheets. Ideally, you would expose the learners to more extended discourse, showing conversation and showing how comparatives are used. Another one, in fact, this is the thing I want to talk about, this paper that I submitted, and you just gave an example of it, which is relative clauses. And so relative clauses, where the classic rule is that in ELT, they're called defining relative clauses. in linguistics, they're
Non-defining.
generally called restrictive or non-restrictive. In the data, what we found was that the most common noun, so the antecedent of the relative clause, are words like something, one, ones, anyone. And you just used an example, Leo, because you said something that I've often thought about with teachers as well. So then you think, hang on, but is there any restriction going on here? Like when you say something that, are we defining the word something with the relative? No. So it's like so you've got this general word like something, anything, and then after you get the lexical content.
Right.
So it just seems to be more like a syntactical structure. It's just a way that we organize the sentence. So instead of having a big, long adjectival phrase before a noun, what you can do is you can just say something that, and then but then you look at the grammars and that's not what they're saying. They're spending all this time comparing, defining and non-defining relative clauses. And with these examples, the passengers who were killed and the passengers who were killed, all these kind of classic examples show, okay, these ones were dead and these ones were not dead, or some of them were
organized,
dead. Yeah, I don't really know it. But, and then the students really struggling to have the difference between, but then you look at the conversational data, there's hardly any non-defining clauses. And anyway, you can't really tell what they are because we don't speak with commas. So you can't really identify them in spoken data. It's very difficult. Right. If you had a corpus where they had transcribed the pauses, maybe. But even that, I know people have tried to do it and it's really difficult. So that's one where, this move towards very concrete prototypical explanations of grammar end up pushing you away from how it's actually used.
Yeah.
Spoken conversation is very different sometimes, right, than how you would write. In what context is it formal? Are you with one? Lee, maybe you hear this. Maybe Graham, you hear this too. I hear this a lot from my students, and they always say, speaking of rules being always true or never true, they say, "Oh, never when you're writing, never start a sentence with the word because." Right? I hear that. They've learned that. I hear that a lot, and I say, "Okay, why do you say that?" And we have a conversation. And they always make, at least in my 99% make the same mistake when they're writing it. And I say, you can. And they do a fragment, right? They just say, because it's raining, full stop. Because in conversation, if you're having a conversation with somebody, the other person would finish the sentence, right?
Mhm.
Oh, because it's raining. And then Leo would say, oh, yeah, we're not going to go. And they would have a natural conversation. But in writing, in that complex sentence, you have to be the other person. You have to add the other element to it. So, of course, you can start a sentence with because, but you have to finish the thought. And most of them end up making a fragment. And so I think it's old school to say don't start a sentence with because it used to be like bad form. But if you just read Atomic Habits or any nonfiction book, not to say that James Clear is the authority on complex sentences, but he uses it all the time. So it's quite interesting to see those kind of examples.
It's really interesting how you phrase that, because you started off, and most people wouldn't do this. You started off as if the spoken form is the kind of the norm, the base form. But then you said, but when you're writing, you have to be the other person.
Right.
But that's right, because we have language to converse, to speak to one another, and written language, it's an evolution of that or a version of that. But we've had to shift this tool we have for communicating with one another to a written context. It's not the other way around. And in fact, we have examples of this in the book as well with relative clauses but I think Mike McCarthy's done a lot of research about this, where in conversation, people are always finishing off each other's sentences.
All the time.
And when you add a comment with a non-defining clause, which is a problem, things like that.
Yes.
We're always doing it. It's this co-construction of grammar. It's really common. And it's in writing that you don't get it. But that writing is therefore the weird thing, because language develops, it's a spoken.
But this is an interesting point, Graham, because it brings me back to, and I'm sure you're very well versed in this, the work of Hunston, the work of Halliday, Hoey, Sinclair, even Dave Willis in Rules, Patterns, and Words talks about that. And you guys make the same argument in the book, is that written grammar is the one that is often being used as a model for how we teach spoken language, even though we know the two can be, as you said, Andrew, quite different. I think before we move into the history of grammar, because I want to talk about that as well, can you perhaps think of some of the most common, because I know a few, But what would be the most common misconceptions, in your opinion, about spoken grammar, and the ones that you think teachers themselves would need to unlearn?
So you mean misconceptions that are held by teachers primarily, or the general public? Or
Teachers, perhaps. I think it's, for our context, I think teachers is better. Yeah.
yeah, it's really a tricky one. I think maybe what I've noticed is that it's very hard to step out of our own experience. It's very hard to switch off everything we've been exposed to. So I can remember when I was doing my PhD, I was teaching on a master's in applied linguistics program. So these were very smart people. I guess most of them were teachers doing this master's, and there was some work being done on prayer and spoken language. And one of the things we looked at was what McCarthy called heads and tails.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say Leo, he's a real pain, right? So you've got the subject twice. You've got Leo, then you've got he. So that's the head. Or you could say, it's disgusting, isn't it, this pastor? So then you've got it, it's the subject, but then this pastor is also the subject. But you're putting it at the end, so that's the tail. And this is incredibly common in spoken language, being described by, I think, Carter and McCarthy. And we talked about it, and there was one of the teachers, and I remember one of the students, on this master's program, and he was Brazilian, and he said, this is all fine, I understand all this, but I just can't imagine ever teaching it. And I got what he meant, because he said, would you ever teach this? Can you imagine going into class and this is your lesson is on heads and tails or whatever? And I don't know how to respond to that, because I'm also a product of the same system. So if I could really start, if we had to just wipe our brains of all our knowledge of English grammar.
Severance. We'll do some severance here.
Yes, exactly. And we just sat down together and we just got a load of English, and we actually tried to build up an account of how English grammar works. But we were using spoken data, conversational data, because magically we had these transcriptions of conversational English. And then we had to say, what are we going to teach? What would we choose? Would we exclude heads and tails?
No.
It's really hard to know. Probably we'd see them so much and think, we should teach that. Teach the fact you can have the subject at the beginning and then you can repeat at the end for emphasis. You might well teach that. That might well come in your curriculum. So I'm not sure it's a misconception. I just think it's what we have is that if we've been teaching a while, we just get so used to what we've always seen in course books, in grammars, and if you learn English, if English isn't your first language, then it was your experience as a learner as well. That's it. That's the grammar. That's the right grammar to teach. And now we're heading towards the history, which you said we're going to do afterwards. That's come from somewhere.
Yeah. It's good. We'll get into that.
So, but do we know that it's the right?
Mm-hmm.
It is the right grammar. Or does it? It feels right because we've always taught it. But does it feel right just because that's what we're used to? The severance would be an interesting mental experiment, isn't it? Kind of a thought experiment.
Do you feel that's so interesting? Like going back to your CELTA experience, right? And then afterwards, I think everyone can relate to having a different experience in the first classroom post CELTA. Is that where maybe this feeling? Like, I like how you've walked through. We're used to it because we're used to it, right? We teach at schools. The course book goes through this and does this. CELTA or other training program starts there. If there was like a CELTA 2.0, maybe CELTA 8.0 by now, how would you approach grammar in a new version of a CELTA?
You don't have much time for grammar, right? So the couple of things I remember we did, I think we were given, it's not really supposed to prepare you for all of the grammar you're going to come across as a teacher in the course books, right? And so you have, as a native speaker teacher, you have these, even I had this as someone who had studied linguistics, these panics of trying to get your head around the grammar that you were going to teach in half an hour, because you just never come across these rules before, because you know how to produce that language, but you don't know those rules formally, explicitly, let's say.
I have that vivid memory. Like one of my first classes was like, you have to teach, it was past simple, present perfect. And I was like, what? And you go home and you learn it, you study it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. There isn't time in an intensive 4-week, 5-week teacher training program, I guess, to cover all the grammar that's
No.
currently covered. So how would we change it? I think maybe in a longer teacher training program, probably a lot of the things that we've already talked about. Patterns, certainly the patterned nature of language that we can't. I think the problem that the way, because we're used to seeing the scope and sequence, the contents page of a course book, and you see those list of grammar points, it gives you the impression, even as a teacher, that with that, you can describe everything in English, right? You can go through any text and say, okay, this is this point, okay, and this is this grammar point. And then that's what happened to me, I think, when I was failing to correct adequately in my mind that piece of writing, because the error was more to do with patterns. When you do go into it like that, you realize, yeah, we don't teach everything that we could teach. And maybe there's some stuff that we teach more than we should, that doesn't deserve the amount of time it gets. Maybe there's some things that we don't teach at all and that we should. And so heads and tails is just one example, but there's loads of things if you wanted to. So I think it would be, again, we're edging towards the history side of things again, but it would be, I think it's important to understand that the grammar that teachers will, either they've learned themselves as a learner because English wasn't their first language, now they become a teacher, or the grammar they've had to discover in all the materials they're going to be given is just a selection and could be questioned,
Right.
could be rethought, and it's actually very recent. The consensus that we have on what should be taught and when it should be taught is very recent, much more recent than you think it was, and doesn't really come from any kind of empirical analysis, anything really. That's not where it came about. So I would think that would be an important thing I would want to communicate to teachers, really, just to understand that there's more to it than what they typically see in the content.
Because there's a line of thinking, right? And I'm not trying to say this diplomatically, but there's a line of thinking that starting with grammar instruction or items for the teacher, it's easier to begin your career to teaching. We talked with Laura Berfonsky last year, who tries to debunk the myth that novice teachers cannot use a task-based approach, where that's too difficult. And she says, no, it's just what you're used to. So I wonder if we were rethinking, grammar is important, obviously, but maybe that the toolbox of will, going to, etc. I don't know. Does it hinder progress as a teacher, especially at the beginning?
I get what you're saying, and I think there is, and I wonder if it is this kind of whether you grew up speaking English or not, so you've come as someone who has or hasn't learnt English as a foreign language or as a second language, because, yeah, when you first start teaching, and every lesson is a new grammar point for you as a teacher, right? If you haven't learnt English
Yes.
as a second language, as a foreign language, and then you have to keep going. And then that you said a toolkit, right? So it is that you're adding these little, now I know that one, now I know that one, now I know that one. And then you start to develop your kind of favorite lessons for practicing things. And then gradually you build that up, and your preparation and the next course you've got to teach is less scary because you look through you're given a different course book, but you look through the contents page of, phew, yeah, I've taught all this before. So there's going to be a lot less preparation time. So I'm not sure it's easier at the beginning. I think it's pretty difficult as a teacher at the beginning to have to teach all this grammar, especially if you haven't been through that as a learner yourself. But it's probably easier in the sense that you feel you're developing, right? So you feel, yeah, every time I'm learning something, and eventually I'm going to get to the end of this list. There's nothing else to learn, isn't there? I now know all the grammar, and but then that becomes dangerous, I think, because you get to the last bit, and I've done everything. I know everything, and then you try and mark someone's work, and you think, I don't know what's wrong with this because wasn't one of the things on the list. I don't think it's easy. Is it a hindrance?
I agree. Easy is the wrong word. It was very hard for me, of course.
I think for most people, a hindrance. I think if you feel that you've got good lessons that are based around a certain grammar point, and they work, and they've worked, your students have enjoyed them, and you've enjoyed them, and they seem to take something from it and benefit from it, then I don't feel that's a hindrance. But I do think, there is this slightly dangerous idea that there is this very limited list of grammar. And I think one of the things as well is you can encourage learners to explore a little bit about certain structures, or you can explore with them. You say, I don't know. And you can look, and that's where if you've got a bit of corpus, nous, You can maybe look at Corpus
Yeah.
Corpus results together in the moment with learners to see if you can see any particular patterns. Because there are questions. Learners will still come up with questions where no one's asked that question yet. Why is it this and not that?
Right.
And you won't even find it even in SWAN, practical English usage.
Oh, I need to find. I
When
need
it
to
was
get on you.
called-
1985. I actually found the date. It
Yeah.
was released originally, and he's still alive. Maybe we
Oh.
should get him on the podcast.
Let's do
Talk
it.
a little bit about that book. But I think that's perhaps. I remember having this conversation with Jane Willis, and I think that's perhaps one of the main reasons why the lexical syllabus never really took off. Because grammar, you only have about 20, 25, 30 structures, and you can neatly organize them into levels and teach them. Whereas Lexis is unlimited. So how do you organize a lexical syllabus? But let's go back to grammar, because grammar, you also, I remember you've written an article for ELT Journal, and I think the title was Grammar. And I don't know if that was the offspring or perhaps the inspiration to write grammar in ELT and ELT materials. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that book because I actually have a copy of the book. I bought that book when it came out. I didn't read the whole book. I read the first maybe four chapters. And I think one of the things you talk about in the book, as you describe, is that the contemporary pedagogical grammar of English is not the result, as you describe in the book, of a systematic or perhaps even empirical process, but rather an evolving consensus that has been shaped by early, as you described, early 20th centuries with the look at the clouds, it's going to rain. Which interestingly, and I don't know if I got this right, but many of whom were non-native speakers.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, definitely at the beginning. I'm just worried what happened to chapter 5, though. You only got to the end of chapter 4 and then gave up. But anyway.
I just stopped. I
No, I'm
I
joking,
think I got
I'm
busy
joking.
now, but I want to go back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, okay. The kind of the story then is around the turn of the 20th century. There were published, linguistics became more of a professional field. So these, what were called, well, some people call them scientific grammars, started to
Oh.
be published for the first time.
Okay.
So they were written by linguists rather than, as in the previous centuries, they were often priests and things like that who were writing the grammars. And those older grammars were for school children. And they're not as bad as you might think if you've... I read a few of them for my PhD. They're not as bad as you might think. They are prescriptive. And they're mainly just very boring. And they also try and spend a lot of time on really unimportant details, but those are because those are the things that you can't, the things that can't be settled easily. Some really, in the book I've got some examples of those, just where they would spend ages discussing, because that's what they thought their job was, partly, was to settle these grey areas of grammar.
Right.
But then you got to these scientific grammars around the turn of the 20th century. And yeah, quite a few of those authors were non-native speakers.
I had no idea. Like when reading, I
Yeah.
remember that. Huh.
So Jespersen was one, and they weren't. So yeah, these were people. There's a review of, maybe I have it in the book, in the ELT journal, from I don't remember which decade, but it's a review of one of these grammars written by I think they say a foreigner, and the review really says that the foreigners they're much better than us, basically. So it's much better at writing these kind of books because they notice things that we just don't notice because it's our first language. It's so obvious doing that now, but
Right.
it was absolutely the case. Yeah, that it really, for a very long time, the business of English grammar description was dominated by non-native speakers.
Very interesting.
But it's, not a surprise, right? If they're the ones
Yeah.
who had to go through it as a language learner in order to be able to write this grammar in English about English, then they would have had to do a lot of analysis themselves and try and think, well, why is it this and not that? Why do I never hear people saying that? And yeah, that was, the interesting thing was that kind of ELT as a profession basically took off around the same period. But they then also had the same sort of vacuum, because where do you go to you're going to go in the classroom? What am I going to teach? Talked about this thought experiment about if you had to start with English grammar from the start again. What do I teach to a load of people learning English as a foreign language? So most of them would have had their own experiences of studying grammar at school. But then how much of that is useful in pedagogical grammar.
Mm-hmm.
And so that you can see that at the beginning of the 20th century, that there was this, I think, to be honest, it wasn't immediately obvious that it would be different, right? That you would need a pedagogical grammar and it would be different from just a general descriptive grammar. And you can see that being developed. And another interesting thing I mentioned in the book is if you look at the ELT journal, there used to be this thing called the question box. And this went on existed, I think, until the 80s. But if you look at it in like the 60s, so the idea of the readers would send in a question.
Right.
Although I'm not convinced it was always a reader. I think sometimes it's
Just them sending them questions.
Yeah, exactly. They're answering, I'm convinced, especially the first few issues. There probably weren't any readers to start with, but the question box seemed to be suspiciously full. Anyway, but most of them were questions about, but they're just, you look back now, it's like, what's the difference between some and any? What's the difference between, I think I have been and I went? When do you use one, use the other? So all of this stuff that we could find so easily now, it wasn't long ago that there weren't the pedagogical answers, pedagogical kind of explanations of that. So the descriptive grammars would talk to you about and describe the present perfect and would describe the past simple, but they wouldn't really be coming at that from the point of view of a question a learner would have, which is why can't I say, I've been there yesterday?
Yeah.
So that kind of developed, and that came from the classroom, of course, because that's, you start to answer those questions when learners are asking you them.
Yeah,
otherwise,
that's true.
They don't occur to you as a grammarian.
I remember in one of your talks, I don't remember if it was a talk, I don't remember if it was a paper, or if it was in the book, because I actually just found a copy here, and I stopped on the conditionals. That's the chapter that I was going to start reading. But I think you've mentioned that some of the choices that these non-native speaker authors, their choices primarily, specifically their coverage of future forms, or they were the ones who established the three-way conditional system. Is that right? How did that come up?
No, I think that was, I don't think we can blame the non-native. I think we have to blame a native speaker for that. That was, I
first,
think,
second, and third conditional.
Yeah, I think that was Alan.
What's the story behind that? Yeah, I want to know that one.
Yeah, I don't know. This is the thing. So there was this book called, what was it called? Living English Structure, I think it was called. And this is interesting because they didn't use the word grammar. The word grammar was out for a long time in ELT because grammar meant this previous grammar like that you did in school. So they prefer the word structure. So I think it was called Living English Structure by W. Stannard Allen was his name. And yeah, that's the earliest one I found that in these three conditional forms. But I feel like it was I think he did it by mistake in the sense that they were just three examples and they were numbered because they were examples. So I don't think he called them like the first conditional, the second, or maybe he was saying like type 1 and type 2 or something like that. But to refer back to the examples, I don't think there was ever the intention that this should be
first conditional.
Like a type of, this is like a type of grammar. That's just literally, they were numbered. Of course, you've got the zero conditional, right?
Yes.
So why is it zero? And again, I haven't quite found the origin of that, but it didn't seem, I've not found it before. I don't think the 80s.
It's like they forgot about it.
They did forget about it. It wasn't there. It was added. And 1, 2, and 3 were already taken. I can't say that for sure because I've never actually been able to pin down the first time it was used. And even if I did, I'm not sure they would explain why. But I've certainly not found any counter evidence to that. It does seem to be literally that it was added because...
I found this in your book. The concept of a zero conditional appears to be more recent than the original three-way distinction. The inspiration for Moll's 1988 study of conditional forms was a student who refused to accept the sentence, "If he comes, I go," was correct. In discussing this, he does not use the phrase zero condition, or nor does in her 1989 follow-up. Fulcher, in his larger study, it was perhaps in response to these or similar articles that the term zero condition was introduced with the label zero, chosen presumably because the numbers 1 to 3 had already been assigned. That's phenomenal. Oh my gosh. What about the mixed conditionals? Where did they come up with that?
They came up with that at some point, noticing that you could do it.
So just
I could call it 4 and 5.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose they called it mixed. Yeah, conditionals is an interesting one. And actually conditionals is, I mentioned that when I did the CELTA and we did a couple of sessions on grammar, I can very clearly remember that we did one on conditionals. And what they did is they gave us a piece of paper, which I think probably had the 4 conditionals on, and got us to discuss, us trainee teachers who didn't know anything about pedagogical grammar, what's the difference? What's the difference in meaning? And then, I don't remember exactly what they said, but it was something along the if you go from the top to the bottom, they become less and less likely. And I remember, that makes sense, what you just said. I can get what they were saying, but I do remember, I don't remember at that point I put my hand up and said, I don't agree. I probably controlled myself because I had done it several times already. At that point, I was very interested in that. And of course, there's been, this conditional seems to be one of the worst offenders of ELT grammar, of the explanations. And it's a bizarre one as well, because as much as grammar is criticized in ELT, if you look at how we refer to grammar, there is a lot of meta language, but it's very often functional. The labels are functional, future forms and modals of possibility and things like that.
Yeah.
Conditional is the only one which has got a number, first conditional, second conditional, third conditional. So they're unusual in that way, that they're not described functionally. So it's not, some people have tried to do that, past hypothetical and present hypothetical, things like that. But they're unusual in that sense. And yes, in fact, we didn't have it in the other book, in the Big Beast book. We didn't actually, me and Chris didn't write a chapter about that because I think we've said everything we want to say, because he wrote an interesting article in the LTJ about 10 years ago, and I did a follow-up one more recently about that. But yeah, that's one way you can look at corpus evidence, and those four conditionals they cover about less than 50% of the conditionals that you find if you just look at a corpus, or even one of those papers that you just read out. I think it was there's one of the authors, because it was a bit pre-corpus, he sat in front of the TV from memory and wrote down every conditional sentence. He did that for a few nights and then did his analysis and discovered that, this first, second, third conditional thing doesn't make much sense, does it?
Oh my. That's fantastic.
I think
Wow.
we found our answers if we were going to start with grammar over again. Clean slate. There it is. That's the answer. Let's work the conditionals and rework that.
But actually, there's an slightly older grammar, but it was also supposed to be a pedagogical grammar by Palmer. That was 1920s, I think. And he has a whole section on conditionals. I think he has 7 types or 8 types. He also numbered them.
Really?
But he didn't have anything equivalent to the third conditional. He seems to have forgotten. Literally just didn't occur to him in his analysis. But there's all these different types. And he numbered them as well. But at some point we settled on
books
these 3
or
types.
curricula do like verb forms as numbers, do they not? Form 1, Form 2, Form 3 for infinitive, base form, third person S.
I've seen all kinds of labels for this. Yeah. Huh. That just makes teaching much more difficult and harder for the learner. Oh my God. Can you imagine? I remember having reading my mom's copy of Raymond Murphy and coming across the first conditional. There was a picture of a guy, and there was like an umbrella, and it was like, looks like it's going to rain. But that's
the clouds. Look at the clouds.
Like if it rains, I will bring my umbrella. It was that kind of thing. But I remember reading that book and just thinking, this is really complex. But eventually just learning how to use it is a different story. But it's a great book. I actually just found my copy here. I found it because I bought it, and I was like, I know I have this book. But anyway, I stopped in chapter 5, jumping into chapter 6, which is conditionals, relative clauses, and future forms. So I'm going to go back and read that. And also the big beasts of English grammar. We should definitely, if you're listening, if you're watching this, highly recommend the book. We're going to have some coupon codes here. Grammar was generous enough to talk to his publisher. So if you're interested in getting a copy of both books, they're going to be in the show notes. So you can get your own copy and learn more about conditionals. But before we wrap up here, I have 2 more questions here, I think, for you, Graham. And the first one is, if you could change one thing, just one thing about how English is taught around the world, what would it be?
You know what? I think having moved around or having worked in different contexts, I would not even try and change something, because I just think how it's taught is so dependent on the context that I wouldn't be so presumptuous to try and think that I have some magic solution that would improve things. Because I've just seen it. There's some things will work in one place and they won't work in another place, and we just cannot assume that we can find a right way of doing things. I wouldn't mind changing the conditionals though, maybe. But I already did. I already explained how in my article for the ELT Journal, I explained how I would reform that particular one. But in general, I just think there's so many local constraints or contextual factors, cultural factors that would mean I think whatever I tried to do would probably not work in most places anyway. It might help in a few places, but sorry, I don't have a magic wand for that one.
That's a good answer. It's a very good answer. And what message do you have for people who are interested in the books? What should they expect from them? I think this conversation will give them some sort of an understanding of what to expect. But what was the message that you're trying to convey to people who actually pick up these two books and decide to read them?
Yeah, they're very different, I think. So the grammar and ALT materials, it's an academic title, but I think it would be interesting to teachers, to most teachers. With that, like I said, I really try to explore this thing that we feel this, I think that a lot of people feel is a done deal, which is grammar, in terms of how we teach it, but the content, right? What we can teach if we're teaching grammar. Seen as something we know, we talked about this. We've got this list of things and that's it, that's the grammar of English. Really what I hope what people would take away from that one is just how random is unfair, because there were smart people who developed it. But I think if you could, like the butterfly effect, you could change a few factors in a certain decade and we probably would have ended up with a completely different catalogue of grammar points, or we might teach them in a different order. So I think that's quite, I think especially with the ordering as well, we're so now have such clear idea, this is what you teach at intermediate or B1, and you can't do that because of that. Why can't we teach beginners, elementary level students, past simple, and then teach them that a person should have and shouldn't have?
No.
They're lucky if they learn should have and shouldn't have at all. But that's so useful, and it's so much part of the human experience, isn't it? That you could,
especially if they're predisposed to saying that. Yeah.
But that's what we like to do. We speculate on the past, have regrets and things like that.
Yeah.
If you doesn't mean you have to call it the perfect modal form. It doesn't seem impossible that you'd want to give students the ability to talk about the past and then to reflect on the past and that's doable. There's no reason why you can't do that. There's nothing saying that because it's a modal and with a perfect form afterwards that you have to wait until some magic level where they can do it. I don't think there's any reason to expect that. So that would be a kind of a message I would hope people would take from that book, which is, just that what we work with is not quite so fixed in stone as maybe a lot of people believe, and that we should be much more willing to innovate, look for new grammar points if we want, abandon others, spend less time on others, because it hasn't really come from any particular kind of magic source of knowledge about what learners need to learn in terms of grammar. And I think it's quite interesting from that point of view, just to follow, to just discover where it all came from, basically. The other one, like I said, for a different book, it's a kind of, but in a way similar, because it is also kind of a reevaluation. So the big beasts, I think what I would hope to show that, what I would hope people would take away from that is in a way something similar, which is that we can look at grammar again, we can pre-think it a little bit, we can maybe focus on, if we have got a group of learners who are primarily interested in speaking, which I think we feel that a lot of them are, that's where we should be looking at data on how people are speaking, and not monologues either, conversation, which is what we did. It's all based on a conversational corpus. And with that book, we tried to be very practical and have takeaways, implications for the classroom. So hopefully that would be, I think, quite practical use for teachers if they are in that situation where they've got that kind of learner that they think would benefit from that kind of book.
Sounds great to me. Grammar in ELT and ELT Materials, Evaluating Its History and Current Practice. That's the first book. And the second one is The Big Beasts of English Grammar. That one co-written with Chris Jones. Graham, it's been a pleasure, man. We've been waiting to have this conversation since last year. I'm glad we made it. And hopefully you'll come back in the future. We had our first repeat guest, but he said amazing things about the work, about your work, about the book. So I can't wait to start reading that one.
No, really enjoyed it. Really nice conversation. So thanks for the invite.